So do you know what Rocco's basilisk is?
No.
It's like a meme in Silicon Valley, and it's about artificial intelligence. And the meme is that if AI does take over the world, and conceivably there would be a point at which humans realize that AI was a thing, and then the delta of like once you knew AI could take over the world, when it does take over the world, it might retroactively punish everyone that fought against it or did not.
Oh yeah, so you should spend time like helping to develop AI.
Yeah, exactly. So the I think the idea of it is like they call it like a basilisk because it's like once you see it, you have to immediately like pivot to AI. Anyway, I have a thing in my head called China's basilisk, which is once you realize that China is going to dominate the world, anyone that didn't help its ascendants is going to get retroactively punished. And anyway, I think we're both kind of believers that China will take over the world, or at least it's plausible. So it helps to kind of start learning about it. And I'm trying desperately to catch up on like understanding China because I didn't really understand anything about it until somewhat recently. And I've read quite a few things about it. And I think that the two books that we're going to talk about now were actually a pretty good 1-2 punch in understanding China.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think so. That idea of taking over the world, though, seems like draconian somehow. And I think it's not like that, but in the sense that, like, I don't know, take over the world in a bad way. But, like, I think that as China just, like, starts to produce more and a higher volume of things that are generally more interesting or useful to people's lives, like electronics, like these cool smartphones from Shenzhen, or like cultural memes and stuff like that too. It will just be really awesome to be able to engage with it in a cool way rather than just like in a, I don't know, like close yourself off from it in a kind of fearful way.
Yeah, so it's not like, it's interesting to learn about China because it will enhance your ability to enjoy the world going forward as opposed to like, it will be like imminent for your survival.
Maybe both.
Is probably like a better meme. Anyway, so Matt, you lived in China for like 4 years, right?
Yeah, I lived for 2 years in Beijing, and then I lived for 2 years in Hong Kong, and about a year in Singapore, which I actually consider to be like a kind of Chinese colony somehow, because like all the important government officials in Singapore are Chinese, and Chinese is one of the official languages of Singapore, and it just kind of feels like Hong Kong light.
Interesting. When were you living there? You were there after college?
Yeah, I moved to Beijing after I graduated college, and then there for 2 years, and then I went to Hong Kong and did a master's degree there, and then I worked for like a year in Singapore.
All right, cool. So the first book on China by Henry Kissinger is the thing. It's kind of like an overview of 21st century Chinese history, and like Chinese history goes back infinitely. And I've tried like reading and like figuring out a bunch of like trying to like catch myself up on it. But what I liked about this book was that it really kind of like just gives you the like greatest hits of about 2 centuries or 2 millennia, and then it kind of just picks up right after World War II, right? So Chinese history literally goes back infinitely. It goes back till the beginning of time, and there's like a bazillion dynasties. I don't know like which ones of them even are like that interesting. I think that it was the Song Dynasty, which is the one that is like in 1200, like from 900 to 1200. That like the thing that I found interesting that he was talking about was that they invented boats and they invented like fleets and naval warfare, but they never actually went and conquered anyone, which is kind of an interesting idea because it's the Europeans that like go and colonize the entire world, but the Chinese had all this technology and they had every, possibility to go colonize people, but they chose not to.
There was an interesting blurb about this in Sapiens by Noah Yale, whatever. And his idea was that, as I recall, that European countries had the perspective when they were exploring the world that they didn't know and they wanted to figure things out. But that when Chinese explorers were exploring the world, they were coming at it from the perspective that they knew everything. And so, like they arrived to different places and were like, okay, whatever, that's cool. But in Europe, they were like, oh, that's fascinating, like Marco Polo and so on. and trying to say like, what can we learn about this place and blah blah blah, and like trying to synthesize all of their technologies and ideas. And then I also have this idea too that like, so China had like this monopoly over East Asia, where like Vietnam and Korea and Japan were like vassal states of them. But then in Europe, it was more like free market-ish, in the sense that like you had like the king of Spain and like the king of Bavaria and the king of Portugal, who were all like vying for like power and relative influence. So if they could incorporate some new idea or technology that they discovered somewhere else, they would like one up their rivals locally. But the Empire of China didn't really have this problem, or like this impetus to self-improvement.
Yeah, that's a meme throughout every reading on China that I've done, is that China believes its culture is unique and it is superior, and there's no need to assimilate other people into it. And that like informs a lot of the decisions that they make. Which, yeah, I don't know. It's kind of fascinating. The one of the things that he talks about when he's yada overing all these like early dynasties is that technology kind of commoditized culture, at least like in the whenever like industrial revolution started. So every culture that wanted to get with the latest, they'd get the same printing press and same cannons and same like plans for invading other countries. But China was really focused on keeping its uniqueness, but that meant falling behind technologically and opening itself up to colonization, because they were like, well, our culture is dope and we don't want all this newfangled like fucking steel shit that you guys are all doing. And then that actually opens themselves up to colonization, which is what happened throughout, like up until basically World War II.
Yeah, I like the idea, I think it's from Kissinger, that China was kind of like a pseudo colony of like the West. But I think it's also interesting that Chinese culture was like robust enough to incorporate Western culture when it came into contact or when it came into conflict with them, which is I think much different than in like South America, where they came into contact with European culture and just kind of disintegrated.
Yeah, it is really interesting. That he was talking about that. So there's this idea of the Chinese response to invading armies is to assimilate them, as opposed to like outwardly oppose them.
It's also different than India, because I think that India was like subjugated by the British for a really long time in a way that China never was. And I think it's just something that I consider when I think about now how China and India are developing, and India seems to be like producing way less things that are like export oriented, like that I would like to use in my own life, like Lenovo computers or like Huawei or Oppo cell phones or something.
DJI drones or things. Interesting. Yeah, so it's kind of, so like, okay, so we're talking about all these, like China, like we're going to just yada over the early history, because I think the stuff that we want to talk about is probably like a bit later, but they were like conquered by the Mongols, like officially, but even in their conquest, like the Mongols eradicated a bunch of civilizations, but they didn't eradicate the Chinese. The Chinese like kind of absorbed them. They're like, okay, you conquered us, but like we're still going to be Chinese. And then like eventually the Mongols just turned Chinese. It's like the coolest idea. It's like you just, okay, we're conquered, but we're going to keep our culture. And then eventually like you grab people into your culture, and then the conquerors are just like the Chinese emperors, and like you survived.
Yeah. I think like this last dynasty, like Qing dynasty.
Yeah, the Qing.
Yeah. They were Mongolian. And then it's interesting because there's this big test in China that you have to take, this Gaokao, which is really important, like the American SAT, but like the SAT on steroids. And then
how's it on steroids? It's just
like more important, like for determining what school you'll go to or how you'll be sorted. Like the SAT, I think, is only just one component of whatever. And then you get extra points on that if you're a minority. But so according to my understanding, it's like really not cool to like identify as a minority in China. But many people identify as this, on the Gaokao, this Mongolian minority, because officially it's like one of their recognized minority populations, but like everyone thinks it's prestigious or whatever. And then you also get extra points on this Gaokao if you do it. So, like, it's a kind of life hack.
Oh, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess, like, we don't realize the granularity of, like, Asian ethnicities because I just think of Asian as Asian. And then you don't realize, like, Mongolian Chinese is different than Chinese and stuff. But it's kind of interesting.
One of the most interesting things that happened to me with this Asian phenomena was I was talking to one of my friends from Pakistan, and I was saying that I think the most beautiful Asian girls are from South Korea. And he said, well, I think the most beautiful Asian girls are from Pakistan. And I was like, oh, interesting. Like, I never would have thought of Pakistan as Asia, you know?
I know I got into it. Yeah, I learned because Pakistan is not the Middle East, right? And, like, you think of it as the Middle East when you're in the U.S. And it's, like, very distinctly not considered part of the Middle East if you talk to anyone from, like, the Middle East.
Yeah, or just, like, Asia. Like, technically Israel is in Asia. But, like, nobody would think of Israelis as Asians. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that is kind of interesting, actually. Okay, cool. So I think if you're just trying to, like, get a, like, the book does, like, yada yada up to World War II, and if you're trying to, like, get a quick overview of Chinese history and what's culturally relevant now, I think it's probably safe. Like, you can basically start with the Civil War in, like, the 1930s or whatever. So I mean, the gist of it, and I'm not super familiar with it, is that they were very much influenced by the communist revolution in Russia that happened, that overthrew the Tsar in, like, the 1910s. And they had a communist revolution of their own. And China, I don't know, like, it was still, like, considered part of this Qing dynasty at this point. They never really had consolidated as a major world power or, like, major economic growth power. They were just kind of, like, getting bitched around by the British and, like... Dude, like, reading about, like, the Europeans' perception of China before World War II is so funny because it's like they would just, like, stroll in and be like, yo, there's all this, like, cool shit here. Like, they just make cool stuff and, like, let's take it and, like, trade with them. But there's never, like, considered, like, kind of, the way I think about it is like Game of Thrones, kind of, where you're just like, they're the continent on Essos and you just don't worry about it. You're like, oh yeah, there's like Dothraki or whatever over there, but they're just not, like, important to the politics of the time. And I think that, like, later resurfaces because Mao to me is a character that reminds me of a Game of Thrones character, like the way that he talks and acts, which I think is funny. But anyway, so Mao is, I don't know, you probably know Mao's history better than me, but he ends up, like, leading this communist revolution in the 1930s.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also that, like, prior to that revolution in China, that all the European countries had these cities that were, like, incorporated into part of their global empires. Like, this city Dalian in the north of China was part of Russia, and Qingdao, like, this Chinese beer that's, I guess, the most popular export beer from China, was from this city, which was part of the German Empire. And if you go there, they still have these, like, wood framed houses in that German style.
So that's where they wanted to make beers from the Germans?
Exactly. And then, like, in Shanghai, they have this French concession, which was part of France. And it's interesting to me how these European, like, culture memes or whatever, like, persisted in the regions where they were. Even other cities, like, in the north, like Harbin, has this Sophia Church, which is, like, in this Russian Orthodox style. And, like, the downtown of the city has, like, European style Rococo buildings and stuff.
Huh.
Yeah.
Because they would just take they would just, I guess it's kind of like America in the early 1900s, where they would just take other cultures and let them set up outposts in various places in New York City, or, for example.
Yeah, there was actually, like, a really interesting political cartoon from that time of China. So it's, like, a cake, and it says China on it. And then there's, like, a caricature of, like, I don't know, Queen Victoria or Elizabeth or something like this. I don't know. Like, slicing into it, and then also, like, this French, like, Marianne.
Oh, interesting.
Like, that female representation of France. And then I think there's one that's, like, this Japanese, like, samurai-looking guy. And then Tsar Nicholas, and also Kaiser Wilhelm. And, like, this Chinese guy's going crazy, and they're all just, like, cutting into it, like, cutting out little pieces of this cake for themselves.
Yeah. Interesting. So, okay, so whatever. There's a communist revolution. The Nationalist Party is led by a guy named Chiang Kai-shek, and they're very anti-communist. And they have a civil war, and there's some interesting stories from that, like the Long March and things that are just interesting, like, military tales. But anyway, the civil war is going on, and then Japan, who had a much more evolved economy at the time and was much more imperialistic, just sees the Civil War as an opportunity, I guess, to just seize land on mainland China for themselves. And they had, like, I don't know, like, Japan was crushing it, like, pre-World War II. Like, they took over, like, the Philippines and...
Yeah, they beat Russia in that war as well.
Yeah, the Russo-Japanese War, the first time an Asian power beat it. So they're just, like, taking land left and right. And they come in and just start taking Chinese land while the Civil War is going on.
And Korea was, like, a colony of Japan, too.
Right, and Korea. What beast? But,
yeah, wait, what is it called? Manchuria.
Right, exactly, is the area that they took. And... from what I got, just reading the brief history that he talks about in On China, is Chiang Kai-shek made a massive media mistake by supporting the Japanese attacks against the communists. So he made the mistake of saying, well, the Japanese are invading our country and launching attacks on Chinese, but they're fucking killing communists, so I'm cool with it. When Mao was like, no, we need to repel the invading Japanese army more so than worrying about people in China that disagree with us. And that ended up winning the hearts and minds of the population way more, that he was very anti the Japanese as his top priority. They were very, I don't know, the communist revolution there is kind of interesting. They just were they had this like philosophy of just peacefully integrating with different communities. So you go into a community, you don't come like aggressively, you come in and just preach about communism and help them with whatever they're working on, just win hearts and minds of the people throughout the land over time, and then eventually, like it was like you should be like a fish in water, like you just like swim into these communities and just so anyway, so there's this massive civil war and Mao ends up winning it. He ends up winning more people to his side. He has a larger army, and Chiang Kai-shek is dispelled to Taiwan. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but so one of the interesting things that I heard about this too was that like Chiang Kai-shek had all of these weapons and money from like the United States and different countries. And so I heard that one of the strategies that the Chinese Communist Army was following at that time, the People's Liberation Army, was that they would take over small villages and farms and stuff, and the Kuomintang focused only on big cities like Nanjing and whatever.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And then so like they would go around and like win. It's like really interesting. I think this strategy of like, it kind of reminds me of this American way in the Vietnam War too. Like you can take and hold big cities and like try and fight decisive battles or whatever, but like then the like Mao's army and the Chinese Communist Army would like occupy the whole villages around it. So like you couldn't transmit like messages between cities and stuff like that, because as soon as you left the city, they would get ambushed or whatever.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of this interesting idea that Kissinger said was the Chinese style of warfare was different than the Western style of warfare. Because the Western style of warfare is very like they think of things as discrete. So you're like, you have battles, you have territory, you have diplomacy, which is what the diplomats do outside of the military. Whereas the Chinese philosophy of the battles is all integrated together. It's like there is no difference between diplomacy and military. It's just one thing. There's no difference between politics and battles. Like battles are politics.
Yeah. It's just interesting. Like, so like I think big difference is also, so there's two books that are like called Art of War, which people think are famous. And then there's one that's like Sun Tzu that is like this very Chinese style. And then you have On War by Karl von Clausewitz, which is like really European style, And so there's all these interesting ideas of it. Like Clausewitz is saying that war is just the continuation of politics by other means.
Right.
And then like in Sun Tzu, he has this idea, like all these other ideas that are also about warfare, but in a different perspective, So I think that this like different philosophy is kind of interesting.
Yeah. He makes an analogy that I found really interesting, which is that people in the West tend to think of war like chess because that's the board game that we're familiar with. And people in the East tend to think of war like Go, which is the board game that they're interested in.
Interesting.
And the difference in Go is that, one, the pieces that aren't on the board matter as much as the pieces that are on the board. So it's like people in the West think of chess. It's like you can see all the pieces and then you arrange them. Whereas Go is like you see the board, but then there's pieces not on the board that can be deployed onto the board. So you're thinking about that. And also the idea of Go is that you should never be surrounded with your pieces because that's how you lose your pieces. So Mao's entire like philosophy was just never get surrounded. And you see that like play out during the Cold War when China's entire philosophy is just don't get surrounded by other armies. And like literally they just take that one point so seriously They're like, oh, Russia, you're trying to surround us a little bit by putting troops in Afghanistan. Don't surround us. That's the only thing that we like care about. I thought it was like, I mean, maybe it's probably like an oversimplification, but it's kind of an interesting idea. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Chiang Kai-shek loses to Mao. He retreats to Taiwan. And this is after World War II now. Mao has officially taken over China as a communist territory the same way that Stalin had taken over Russia and Eastern Europe as communist territories. The U.S. is very anti-communist at this time, so they're supporting Chiang Kai-shek, and specifically, they put the U.S. fleet in between. What do you call it? The Taiwan Strait, like the thing that's between Taiwan and China.
Formosa Strait or something.
Yeah,
like this?
I don't know what it is. But
I don't know
whatever.
either.
They put the U.S. fucking Navy in between China and Taiwan, so like they mark their territories because China would have just taken Taiwan.
Yeah, I think that MacArthur once called Taiwan unsinkable battleship or something like this.
Yeah, exactly. So and it's kind of like this weird like. I mean, China and Taiwan is, like it's just a long-running meme now that it's a really big issue. But the idea was that when they created the United Nations, because that was created by the Western powers, they recognized Taiwan as just the voice of the Chinese government. So it wasn't that Taiwan and China are separate things, because both parties thought that they were the government of China. So Mao thought he was the government of China. Shek thought he was the government of China. The West recognized Taiwan. And then everyone else recognized Mao, which was also accurate because Mao was running China at the time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, also, it's pretty hilarious. If you look on the Wikipedia page of Taiwan, they claim that they are, like, the representatives of all of China and even Mongolia and stuff like this, too.
Yeah.
And then Chinese government right now claims that they're, like, the leader of, like, all of China, including Taiwan and so on. So I think that's just interesting. It's like... Like, you can say that you're, like, the representative of, like, whatever place, but if you aren't, then,
Yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Right.
And then so I always... Like, there was another thing I was reading, too, that, like, in the Chinese Civil War, like, there was some time when, like, if they had invaded Taiwan, they could have just taken it, but then they just didn't do that, and I think it's fascinating. And then also, it makes me think of this anecdote that I heard from... when Nixon went to China. And so, like, one of the important things that they had to talk about was Taiwan. And they broached the subject. And so there's some story that Mao said something like, even if you were to offer me Taiwan right now, I wouldn't want it because it's just full of counter-revolutionaries.
Right.
I'll worry about Taiwan in, like, 300 years.
Yeah. It's in this book. It's one of those things that makes me think of, like, Mao as, like a Game of Thrones character. Because he just, like, speaks in, like, aphorisms. And then they, like, Nixon and Kissinger just had to decipher his aphorisms and be like, what the fuck is this dude talking about? Like, so he says, like, Nixon, he's like, the counter-revolutionaries may hold Taiwan. They may hold it for 100 years, but the time will come for us to take it. Yeah. And they're, like, trying to figure out, like, does this mean he's going to invade Taiwan or not? Like,
yeah.
It's like, I think that means he wants Taiwan, but he's not going to act on it right now, but we're not 100% sure.
Yeah, and then also it's interesting, too, that, like, so there's, like, these countries that have had, like, continuous history from, like, thousands of years. So, like, the Greeks are one, and, like, the Persians are one, Egyptians are one, and I guess, like, Romans are one, and then China is one. But, like, and so it's fascinating that, like, leaders of China think about things in terms of, like, broad sweep of history that goes on for, like, hundreds of years. Whereas, like, American politicians, like, the country of America itself is less than 300 years old.
Right.
And then, like Nixon has to, like, worry about these concerns of, like, being elected and so on, like American electoral domestic politics, which are, like, preventing, like, a kind of really long-term coherent strategy, I think.
Oh, that's kind of interesting. Yeah, that makes total sense. He's thinking about how do I win the next election. I mean, that's famously, like, why Kennedy wanted to escalate involvement in Vietnam. Was he's like, it's a terrible idea. It's a completely unwinnable situation, but I'm not going to get reelected if I cede Vietnam to the communists. Like, that's the logic that they think about it on. So when you have those really short-term elections, yeah, I mean, there's definitely an argument to be made about that, right? Anyway, so where the Civil War is lost, and then now China during the Cold War is that's what most of this book is about. Is China is like and it's told from the American perspective of Henry Kissinger, who I guess we should say was the Secretary of State under Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, and he's famously involved with reestablishing formal relations with China. So in the 1950s, U.S. saw China as an enemy, right? They're one of these communist countries in this communist bloc, but China was like a very different communist country than Russia, and the relationship between Stalin, Mao, and like Kim Il-sung, who's the head of North Korea at the time, is just super funny to me because people like Stalin had only just taken over this new Soviet empire. Mao had just taken over China. Like Korea had just been liberated from the Japanese. So in a sense, these like Asian communist countries were the startups of the world, and America, even though it was the new country compared to like Europe, was the bureaucracy. They were, hey, we've been around for like 200 years or something at this time. We have formal board meetings where we decide on things. And the way that you guys make military decisions is like Stalin and Mao and Kim Il-sung get on a 3-way phone call and like yell at each other. And like, that's your decision making, you know? So I guess like right after World War II ends, Russia had, you know, held off the German invasion into Russia. They had beat them back westward, all the way back to Berlin, and then taken Berlin. And then you have this awkward situation now where the entire European continent is basically has Russia's standing army on it. And that, you know, spawns this Cold War where the U.S. is like, well, what are we going to do about all this Russian army that's taken over massive amounts of land? And they're worried about a communist revolution in the domestic homeland. They declare communism the enemy. And they have this, you know, policy of containment where they're going to fight it wherever it is. And the first place is Korea.
Yeah, and Asia had America's army on it. Like, you have MacArthur, in Japan, who's, like, ruling over Japan like some demented viceroy or something like this. And then, so I think this is really fascinating. And then, another thing that I heard was that, like, right before the U.S. nuked Japan, the Soviet Union defeated Germany. So Germany was out. And then they were like, okay, and now we declare war on Japan, too. And then I think they started taking like parts of this Japanese empire, like Sakhalin Island, and like incorporating this into the Russian Empire. And so there was like this big stress about like Russia putting troops in Japan too, and whether Japan would turn into part of the communist bloc. So like I heard this thing that right after the World War, they just so Japan signed this unconditional surrender or whatever. And then they just immediately started pumping cash into Japan to turn it into like an American client state and prevent it from turning communist.
Right. Yeah. That was like in that Kroeber book so there's a book on like this German family that runs a steel empire where, I mean, literally funding the Nazi war machine. And the Second World War II ends. Instead of punishing this guy and hanging him at the Nuremberg trials, America's like, hey, we could really use your steel manufacturing to fight the Russians. So what do you think?
Yeah.
Right? So that gets crazy. And what the first conflict is the Korean War, and the Korean War is essentially fought by the Chinese against the Americans, which is funny, right? Because it's in Korea, but it's like the U.S. versus China.
Yeah. Like a proxy war.
Right, exactly. But what's so funny to me was thinking through how the invasion of Korea actually happened. Because it's just so it's like a TV sitcom of Stalin, Mao, and Kim Il-sung trying to figure out if it's a good idea to take South Korea, and none of them having any fucking clue what they're doing, but having absolute power. So literally their whim is going to decide if this like invasion goes on. And you have this like funny scene of Kim Il-sung wanting to invade South Korea and then asking Stalin, "Hey Stalin, are you going to have my back?" And he's like, maybe. We'll see how it goes. He's like, well, that's not good enough. He's like, well, have you asked Mao? And then he like calls Mao and he's like, yo, are you going to have my back? He's like, what did Stalin say? He's like, he said to call you. He's like, well, I don't know. If Stalin's in, I'm in, but I don't like want to go without Stalin. Because like Mao has this like inferiority complex with Stalin at the time, where Stalin's like, well, we're the real communist revolution, and you guys are like taking Karl Marx's ideas and screwing them all up with your, you know, farmers. Like we don't say anything about farmers in the Communist Manifesto. And just like completely like giving Mao the cold shoulder as like his little brother. And Mao's like trying to prove he's cool to Stalin, and he's like, all right, fine, like maybe we will invade Korea, Stalin. So it's like this like really weird dance that eventually ends up with them invading Korea and the whole Korean War happening.
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating. Like, so according to what I know about this Korean War, like North Korea like just blitzkrieged them and then like pushed all the way to this one city of, I think it's called Busan, in like the south of Korea, like the very, very tip. And then MacArthur mounted this like super dope counter invasion at the most unlikely place, this place called Incheon, I think, where they have like these 40-foot seawalls that are just like total cliff face. And it's like the last place that you would expect somebody to try to mount some like amphibious invasion from. But then it was a success, like a huge success. And they were able to like take back, I think like 75% of the Korean peninsula like immediately. And then they just start pushing north and like getting really close to China. I think it's the Yalu River that separates like this Korean peninsula from mainland China. And then as soon as they started getting close to this, like the Chinese army just like counter invaded them like in a huge way, and then just busted them out. And then MacArthur was disgraced, and this guy Matthew Bunker Ridgway had to come and save the day.
Yeah, I don't know very much about the actual battles of the Korean War, which is, we probably should, because there's a bunch of like Korean War veterans that are still like hanging around.
Yeah,
and
like in
they probably have crazy stories right now that I think about
in The Big Lebowski.
Well, that's Vietnam.
No, it's Korea, I think.
That Walter Sobchak.
Yeah.
He's talking about Vietnam the whole time.
No, the guy who's like the rich guy, the Big Lebowski.
Yeah. Lebowski. Yeah, exactly. Because that's why he's like paralyzed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, right? So like the Korean War is like total disgrace, and like no one really likes to talk about it because it's like, you know, there's no like big day where we celebrate the Korean War or anything like this.
Oh, yeah, interesting. Because there was no victory. It was like we didn't win.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, Korean War is just the total thing, and then I guess it goes up until, and I guess at this time, what was really interesting is, so China and Russia had signed this treaty. It's a peace treaty. It was a 30-year peace treaty signed in 1949, and it was like called the Sino-Soviet like Agreement of Friendship, and that's like their deals. Like they're going to be tight with each other. But as the U.S. and Russia are having this, escalating conflict, China's kind of like playing free agent a little bit. They're not as committed to supporting the Russians. Like they didn't really pick a side. They never like fully supported the Russians, and they never fully opposed them. They were kind of just like playing free agent. And I'm not sure what exactly specifically tips the scales to. So like it kind of is like if you looked at America's relationship with China during the Cold War, like starts really low and then is just a pure escalation upwards, I think. And at some point, something tips the scales, and they get a little worried about like this Go invasion, where like they get encircled of Russia taking territory, Russia like in Cambodia and Vietnam, and the kind of stuff that they're getting a little close to China's territory, and they start to at least signal openness to working with the West, and that's really where this story of Kissinger and Nixon like picks up. And it's just Mao, it's so funny. Like, he literally just talks in aphorisms the entire time. Like, he gives speeches, and he just slowly starts throwing in things like, when there's one invading army on your shores and one enemy army far away, wouldn't it make sense to care more with the enemy army far away? And it's just like, okay, you came up with like a fortune cookie thing to signal that you think you're probably going to work with the Americans over the Russians or whatever. And, yeah.
One thing that I think is interesting about fortune cookies is that you never see fortune cookies in China.
Ever?
Yeah.
Where do they come from?
Like some Chinese immigrants, United States, just like came up with this idea and started putting them in like Chinese takeout boxes.
They're not even real things?
Yeah, I don't think so.
That's really funny.
But, yeah.
I didn't know that. But so anyway, so America and China start this really funny dance over the course of like 2 years of establishing formal relations, because America had no formal ties with China whatsoever, or
even the opposite, like they had ties with Taiwan, which they had to break.
Right, exactly. But I mean, like they didn't have there was no Facebook Messenger or whatever at this time, so there's not like they couldn't even just like ping anyone to like they wanted to like talk to Mao, but no one had anyone that could talk to Mao. Like they didn't even know how to get in contact with him. Yeah,
but so it's also interesting that we were talking before about Pakistan too, because Pakistan and India also plays like a really interesting dynamic in this whole thing. Like when the U.S. planes like were flying Kissinger and Nixon over to China, they first landed in Pakistan, and then flew from Pakistan in,
Yeah.
And so that's fascinating, right? And like this is another interesting thing about India. So like India allied themselves really heavily with Russia during the Cold War, and Nehru was like, like kind of communist, but like tried to hold out this thing of like a third way or whatever, which was kind of farcical. Like, I'm not going to be an ally of the Soviet Union. I'm not going to be an ally of America. I'll just do my own thing. But actually, they were really like closely allied with Russia. And even still today, they get a lot of their military equipment and military hardware from Russia.
Which is strange, right? Because they speak English.
Yeah, and then Pakistan gets all their military hardware from America.
Which is strange because they, harbor terrorists.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, man. Oh, dude, I meant to tell you this earlier. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but it's so fucking crazy. Do you know Osama bin Laden's son is, like, alive and, like, leading Al-Qaeda right now? Like, we killed, like, his entire family except the one son named Hamza bin Laden, and, like, he escaped. And now it's, like, fucking Die Hard 5, where, like, the son is gonna, like, lead this revenge. Like, how are we not fucking freaking out that his son is just leading an army right now? It's fucking terrifying. All right, yeah. Like, it's obviously going to come to heads, right? Hamza bin Laden's going to, like, hijack some screens and it's going to be like, all right, whatever. So anyway, yeah, this gets to a point that I think is actually pretty interesting, or at least, like, something I've been thinking a lot about. So we have this, like, crazy 2-year cycle of reestablishing contact with the Chinese that Kissinger talks about in depth in this book, that involves, like, a ping pong tournament as, like, a guise for, like, a secret diplomatic mission where there's some ping pong tournament in Japan that the U.S. team and the Chinese teams are both playing in, and they use this as a cover to, like, oh, we're just watching our ping pong team, like, fucking play. Like, that's why we're sending our diplomats there. And, like, they do, like, these secret, like, message passing to, like, get a formal meeting. And the Chinese government invites the U.S. ping pong team to play in China, which they use as, like, another excuse for message passing. And then they have this thing that you were alluding to, where Henry Kissinger smuggles himself into China, like, without anyone knowing. So he goes to Pakistan, and then he's like, oh, I'm sick, I'm gonna just, like, chill out for a couple days, and then, like, does, like, a barrel roll out of a fucking limousine into, like, a private plane, and, like, flies to China, and, like, has a secret meeting with Zhou Enlai, who... So Zhou Enlai is, like, the Kissinger of China, I guess.
People love him in China.
Zhou Enlai?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Because, so, there's this really interesting thing, too, that, like, people, like, in the Cultural Revolution, when Mao was, like, destroying all this, like, ancient Chinese culture and stuff, which is just also another totally fascinating
I completely
thing.
Skipped over that, but yeah.
Yeah, so this
we should talk about this.
Yeah, I really like it, because it's, like, okay, so, I always think about Venice, right? So Venice is, like, beautiful, you go there, but it's, like, a museum, like a living museum. And then, like, everything you look at is, like, so beautiful and old, but then also, like, decrepit. And, like, when the tide comes in, like, Piazza St. Marco is, like, totally full of water and stuff and, like, unusable. So, like, it's fascinating to me that China is, like, able to, like, be so successful in this modern world. And I think that part of it has to do with the fact of, like, looking forward and not looking backward. So, like, you can look back and think about how great Chinese history was for, like, 2,000 years or whatever, and it reminds me of people who, like, peak in high school and are like, oh man, remember, like, how dope that football game was? Yeah, like the uncle in Napoleon Dynamite.
Right.
And so, like, I think it's fascinating. Mao was like, fuck all of that, destroy it, burn it to the ground, and, like, let's go forward only. And I think it's, like, it's interesting also that it happened in Germany, where, like, all these old beautiful German cities, like, destroyed, and it's like, okay, like, all that shit is over, let's just move forward. And also in Japan it happened. And so in America, we never had it because, like, we always just were, like, this frontier.
Oh, so, like, we're still over-idolizing our founding fathers or whatever.
Or, like, for me, it's kind of like we just had, like, this open frontier, like, and could just, like, build something. It was like a tabula rasa. And then, like, yeah, so
you never had the rebirth cycle.
Yeah. Or, like, never being, like, weighed down by your past or something like that. So I just think that this is, like, a fascinating idea because, like, so in Germany it was done to them, like, bombed, and then they have to go forward. But, like, in China they did it to themselves. Right. Or, like, Mao was like, tear it all down.
So it's actually, so getting to another interesting point is, like, so this book on China is way too apologetic for Mao. So, like, that's why I skipped over all the terrible stuff, because, like, Kissinger skips over all the terrible stuff. But I guess it's just worth noting. So when Mao, in, like, 1958 to 1962, I think, or maybe earlier, like in the 50s, he proposes, like, this thing called the Great Leap Forward, which is, like, when China goes full communist. It's like, we're going to do all these fucking dope land reforms where we seize all the land and, like, own it to the state. And then we're going to, like, ration, like, the amount of food people get and, like, make sure no one can get rich. And we're going to become, like, super progressive with our architecture. So we're going to, like, have, like, 4-year period where we, like, build, like, the most, like, world-renowned dams and shit. And
make the most steel. Like, to just, like... exactly. Like...
And then you have, like, these dudes that are, like, architects. Like, the shitty steel you're manufacturing is never gonna fucking hold up a bridge. And the schedule you have for completing these dams is way too aggressive, and it's obviously never going to work. And you can't just like modernize your country in 4 years just by like saying that you will. Yeah. Like you can't like cheat science.
It's like that stupid book, The Secret. It's like, oh yeah, just like think that you're the shit, and then you'll be the shit.
Right,
it's
exactly.
Like, yeah.
And it's so funny because I just read the Bad Blood Theranos book also, and that's kind of how it was. It's like you have this startup culture in Silicon Valley of, well, just fake it till you make it. You know, like just be Steve Jobs, like have a reality distortion field. And like it works when you're making fucking like web apps or whatever. But when you're making like biotech and some guy's like, yo, you just can't fucking do all those blood tests on one drop of blood. You need more blood. Like I don't care if that's your fucking vision. Like science doesn't work that way. And that was like the problem with Theranos is she tried to just, circumvent science, and it was a complete fucking disaster. But Mao tried to circumvent reality with his vision of communism, and it ends up in a total catastrophe in which probably 50 million people are killed because all of his dams break and like flood the farms.
Or like all the steel that they made in these like backyard foundries is like unusable.
Right. And then because of the structure of the political system at the time, everyone was disincentivized for like if they had their collective not produce enough rice or whatever, they would get penalized for it. So they would just lie about the amount that they were producing so they didn't get in trouble. And then, China was like, okay, well, given the numbers of grain that we have, we can export this amount of rice to Russia. And just all the numbers didn't add up. And it ends with, 50 million people starving to death or some horrible thing like that.
Yeah, it's also interesting that happened in the Soviet Union too, I think. Like these big famines.
Oh, but like the Holodomor or whatever in Ukraine. But that was like intentional, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
That was like, he like did that on purpose.
But they also had some giant famine, didn't they?
Right, where I know in Ukraine, it's like 10 million people are killed in a famine. But I think it's more like, I don't know. I don't know the specifics of that, but yeah. But it's interesting though that all this shit happened, and Kissinger's like super apologetic to it. Like he doesn't even like mention it. He's just like, well, Mao was an interesting guy, and we did all this cool diplomacy, and it's just not even relevant to him, like his political,
So I think Henry Kissinger is so interesting because, like, for instance, like the way that he talks about China in the way, like, and the parallels that he makes between China and Wilhelmine Germany.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because I think that, like, so having, like, he was born in Germany.
Henry Kissinger was?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, his real name is Heinrich Kissingen. And he immigrated to the United States in, like, the 1930s. So, like, I think that, yeah, he just, like, brings such an interesting perspective to, like, foreign policy and all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
But anyway, so that was the Great Leap Forward. It's a complete catastrophe, kills unspeakable amounts of people, and then they run it back with the Cultural Revolution, which happens like 5 years later. So after the Great Leap Forward is a miserable failure, and they recover. And like it's kind of interesting like how things like that play into modern China because. Like after World War II, there's like the baby boomers, right? Which is an entire generation of, oh shit, so many people died in the war. Like, let's all have like a ton of kids. Like China has their version of baby boomers now, like because of the Great Leap Forward. Like all these people died in a famine that now they have their baby boom generation right after that, which is now like relevant for the way that their economy works, which we'll get to. But anyway, so the Cultural Revolution is super interesting because that's when they do like full communism too, like Electric Boogaloo. And they're like, all right, so maybe we can't just like meme architecture and modern agricultural policies into reality. But what we can do is like meme like political authoritarianism and like it's a really, I don't know, like the stuff I read about the Cultural Revolution is so fascinating. So like, for example, Mao wanted to like basically indoctrinate the youth with his teachings and his vision of communism, and for like an entire year shut down every university in the country to let everyone be an activist. And it's insane that was a real thing that happened in a country in like the 1960s.
Yeah, and also, so this is interesting too, because I think that the 1960s was just like a crazy time, like all over the world. In America, you had like hippies and so on, and then like in China too, like in the 1960s, everything was going crazy. But it's funny because like, so in the United States, there was like this sort of like hippie movement, sort of pseudo like cultural, like in the sense of culture revolution in America with
interesting.
Yeah. But then in China, it's like really fascinating that I think it's like they got ahead of it and they were like, all right, let's like facilitate a revolution, but like a revolution on our terms, not like be like.
Oh, so they can sense the revolution coming, and they're like, let's just instead of letting it organically,
right? Like, let's not let revolution act on us. Let's act on revolution. You know,
like it's like the state-sponsored revolution.
Yeah.
It's like hilarious.
Yeah, and then also there was this thing I was reading too, where he was talking about like caloric intake, and he was like, like they would have, I guess, like they would know how much like calories people were ingesting,
right?
And he was like, okay, so we need a little bit more revolution. So like, let's authorize like more food for people, because like if they have more calories, then they'll be like more enthusiastic about like going and tearing down ancient pagodas and stuff like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's really wild. Like, read about the Cultural Revolution. It's so fascinating. But he, you know, you have like people like the Red Guards, which are people like, so he has a red book that's all of Mao's like famous sayings.
Yeah.
And then people would like walk around with them and be called like Red Guards, and it's like this fucking Lord of the Flies situation. We have like 17-year-olds with his red book, like completely indoctrinated. Attacking like intellectuals that are just like, dude, this is silly, and then they just like execute them.
So like one of my best friends from China was telling me that his father, like so they encouraged kids to like rat out their parents and say if they were like counter-revolutionaries or whatever, if they were griping about the government at home. And so, like, his father narked out his grandfather, like, went to the school and was like, yeah, my father's a counter-revolutionary. He was saying this bad stuff against the government. Yeah. And then so they had to go, like, and then, like, later he found out that this happened. So they all went and, like, lived in the woods for a while, went until it chilled out, and then, like, they came back after. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but, okay, so this is one thing that you get when you start reading about China is, like, you just have stories like this that are just origin stories of people and like adventures of people that are just so unfathomably like more adventurous that would exist in the US or like in the Western world at all. You know, like fucking Deng Xiaoping, who's the guy that's going to eventually take over for Mao.
Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah, Deng Xiaoping. He was exiled twice during the Cultural Revolution. Like, and you just hear it's like, oh, he's been exiled.
Also, his son was like pushed out
thrown off a building.
Yeah. Like thrown out of a building and then paralyzed, like as a paraplegic for the rest of his life. But then he still like always loved Mao and stuff like this. It's fascinating.
But he's like thrown. Like, it's like you don't have people in the U.S. that were like exiled into other. It would be like if Julian Assange came back to run the country or something.
Yeah,
where it's like, oh, this dude was in an embassy in exile for 6 years and then came. It's just like the level of scale of is just so much more interesting. The drama is way there. But anyway, the Cultural Revolution. That's also when Chinese forks, I guess, like the language forks into. Mao wanted to increase the literacy rate, I suppose, because the literacy rate was like abysmally small. And it's because the Chinese language is, like super hard to learn. They don't have an alphabet, which is, it's actually kind of interesting, right? So the Chinese language, I would call it like super conservative, where they didn't adopt all these like modernizations of language throughout like history. But it also is kind of cool because it has a connection to the past that other languages don't. Whereas like the U.S. language just adopted all this different stuff willy-nilly. Or like English, I mean, just in general, like adopted things from other languages and just kind of evolved. Chinese was very, very slow to adopt things. And because of that, it's kind of interesting that you are forced to consider the meaning that your ancestors put into words, like as you like speak in words, which is just a fascinating concept in and of itself. But anyway, so the Chinese language forks where Mao tries to increase the literacy rate by simplifying a lot of the different characters, and Taiwan refuses to adopt the system. So now there's like kind of a forked version of Chinese, which is kind of interesting. But yeah,
and also, so like I experienced this when I was living in Hong Kong, because like in Hong Kong they still use the traditional characters, and they also weren't subject to this like Cultural Revolution stuff. So there's just like little pagodas and stuff that you'll see around Hong Kong that you don't see in China.
Oh, because they were all like torn down.
Yeah. Oh, and another fascinating thing is, so I went to this like there's these 5 famous mountains of Buddhism in China, and so I went to visit one of them, and they have like monks and stuff that like live on the top of them or whatever, and they have all these really nice temples or whatever. But then when you go and read the little blurb about the temple, it always says something like, oh yeah, this temple was like destroyed in a flood in 1960, or this temple was destroyed in an avalanche in 1960 and then rebuilt or whatever. But so they were not destroyed in an avalanche, they were destroyed by the Cultural Revolution, and they just rebuilt them.
Right, and they just like yada yada over.
Yeah.
It's interesting. But so anyway, so there's a lot of turmoil obviously at the time, and Kissinger just ignores all of it, and he's just like, all right, so then some things happened, and now it's 1970 and we're making relations with Mao. So anyway, so the original point that I was trying to get back to was that there's kind of this like glorified, like if you read this story of how Nixon and Kissinger went to China and reestablished connections with the Chinese, and they have this like Shanghai Communique, which is an official government sponsored document which acknowledges that there's now like formal relations between the US and China. It's so mythologized. Like the story is so badass, and it makes, you know, like being Secretary of State and going on these secret missions of diplomacy seem like so cool and interesting. And there's something about it that seems so like out of sync with modern reality. So like at the time, I believe that this was like a really cool story. Like Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon did this, you know, jujitsu to get China on our side and become an ally. And like Zhou Enlai is like a total badass that, you know, was able to convince Mao and the Chinese government to make relations with the West and modernize their, you know, entire political system and economy. And this is going to end up making hundreds of millions of people's lives significantly better, like going forward. But I think that like modern politicians probably like read this mythology and try to emulate it, where they're like, oh, it's so cool to be like this badass like Secretary of State that, you know, can like go reestablish connections with a different country, or oh, like we're gonna single-handedly like admonish the Russians for something. But because of the way that the world works, where it's not like, it's like if I want to like learn about China, I just like go talk to people that live in China and like hang out with them, or like go there. And you don't really need these like people that are like at the top of the level to like create these mythologies for you. And there's something about it that just, when you read about it, just seems so not like, it's like most people realize that our international relations with other countries are like made by you individually because the entire world is accessible. It's not made by like some dude LARPing as, you know, the great diplomat that's going to solve everything. And this was kind of like just like a flash in the pan that this era existed where one diplomat could do something heroic and, you know, change the course of history. Where now it's like seems like way more decentralized and distributed, where it's just everyone can go do things like this and you don't need that, you know, person to do it.
Yeah, totally. I also think about this a lot. Like, for instance, in the time of the Cold War, like we just couldn't travel to like Russia, or we couldn't travel to China at all. So like, it's fascinating that now we can do, but for instance, we can't travel to Iran.
Right.
So like,
but it's also, you do like meet Iranians in the US.
Yeah, that's true.
Like you, like I know a bunch of people, like I have friends that are Persian, and it's just my, you know, opinion of Iran is going to get colored by like the people I know that are Persian.
Yeah.
You know, like it's not going to get colored by what some diplomat tells me to think. And that's what's so different. It's like it was that time where you couldn't go to China. Like there were no Chinese immigrants in the U.S. in the 70s, barely, right? So your entire perception is colored by these like diplomatic missions.
Or actually there are Chinese immigrants, but like they're people who fled China and stuff like this, and they bring with them like their own like super anti-China perspective.
Right.
So it's fascinating to me as well that a lot of my friends who are Chinese, like of ancestry, who grew up in America, are like super anti the Chinese government and all this kind of stuff.
Well,
you know, which is fascinating.
They have this term. I learned this term recently. It's called ABC, which means American Born Chinese.
Yeah.
And it's like it's a term to describe people of Chinese ancestry that grew up or they're born and raised in the U.S. And it's interesting that they all speak Cantonese. None of them speak Mandarin, because Mandarin is like the official government language that was only created somewhat recently, and is.
I think it's actually just Beijing dialect Mandarin.
But it's like formalized, right, as the like language of the Chinese government. Where if you're from some province in China and you speak some other dialect, right, you're not like, and you flee the government because you were, you know, in the Tiananmen Square protests or something, and you get kicked out, or like you have to run for your life. Well, you're not going to teach your kids the language of the Chinese government that they're trying to formalize. You're going to teach them your own dialect that you spoke and you have history with. So a lot of the ABCs in the U.S. don't speak Mandarin, which is kind of interesting. You know?
Yeah, but I think another interesting thing is that, like, in Taiwan, they speak Mandarin. And then also, like, in Singapore, it's Mandarin is, like, the official language there. And it's, like, the Mandarin that you would read, like, out of a book. Or, like, that you would learn in, like, some Chinese language program. Because, like, Beijing dialect also has all these other weird things, like this Erhua, which is this kind of, like, weird sound that comes at the end of sentences. Like, there's this nightclub district in Beijing called Sanlitun. And that's like the kind of sterilized Mandarin version of it. But like the really Beijing dialect of it is Sanlitwer. And it's like this character that looks like this. It's called Erhua. So like if you're talking to like a Beijing taxi driver, he'll be like, oh yeah, I can take you to Sanlitwer.
Right. So the differences in the dialects in each specific region are way more pronounced than they are in the U.S. Or like
because I think in the U.S. we have an alphabet, and alphabet maps to sound. So, like, a word cannot be so different, like tomato and tomato, right? They still sort of sound the same. But in China, like, if it's just a picture of a tomato, then, like, the sound is totally divergent. Because, like, in China, they encapsulate the meaning and memorize the sound, whereas we encapsulate the sound and memorize the meaning.
Right.
So it's just like an interesting
so when
like,
they
semantic
see
reversal.
A character, they're gonna think of the meaning, and the sound is like the implementation detail.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas in the we think of the sound, and then the meaning is the implementation detail.
Yeah. Totally. So I think it's just fascinating. Like, there's so many things like this about Chinese culture that are like a totally reasonable way of like implementing some like meme, like culture meme, but they just like implemented it in a different way. So that's fascinating to me.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to me also as I'm like starting to try to learn Chinese, just seeing that kind of different system and the decision, like how those decisions like play out. Yeah. So anyway, so we were in the 70s, Kissinger and Nixon, they do this crazy like dance and then reestablish relations with Zhou Enlai and Mao. And I think that it really picks up when, well, actually it's kind of interesting. I don't know about this like Vietnam War 3 thing, which is kind of interesting. So like, as I was saying, they signed this like Sino-Soviet pact in 1949 for 30-year duration. And basically the day the pact ends, China invades Vietnam, which is crazy because like they call this like Vietnam War 3. And like we think of the Vietnam War as like one thing, but they think of it as 3 parts, where first part was the French colonization.
Oh, yeah,
the French are expelled by the Vietnamese. The second part is the American invasion, and they're repelled. And then the third part is like the Chinese invasion of Vietnam.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah. Like my really good friend's girlfriend's father was in this war. Like, so it was also really quick. Like they just invaded Vietnam. Because like what I heard was that the Vietnamese military was getting lots of weapons from Russia at this time, and like Soviet military advisors and stuff like this, which was antagonistic to the Chinese Communist Party. Because there was also this like Sino-Soviet split that was like Kissinger and Nixon were trying to exploit. And like at the time that they went to China, I think it's in the Kissinger book, like the Soviet military was like mounting like military divisions on the border of China,
right,
and like posturing like they were going to invade them or something like that.
And they're thinking in terms of go, which is just don't get surrounded.
Yeah,
so they take it really personally when you try to surround them. That's what I've learned.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the tensions between the China and Russia start turning, and I think it really it definitely hits its peak with the Afghanistan invasion by Russia. And it's kind of interesting, right? So you have Kissinger and basically getting I don't even remember if it was Kissinger at this time or whoever succeeded him, getting China to support, right? Like Mao is railing against the imperialist Americans for like 50 years, and then they get him to turn and be like, yo, can we like get some of that imperialism in Afghanistan, get those Russians out? Like, we like this imperialism shit you guys got going on when it helps us.
Yeah, so like, this is also interesting, right? Like how, so after like years and years of like saying that like America is like the devil and blah, 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 that like they have to have this reversal where like America is now their friend and like Russia is their enemy.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because my friend from Cuba was also telling me about this. Like, it's really weird when a government has to like totally change their stance. It's like what happened in Nazi Germany, like when they first started out as allies of the Soviet Union, like with this pact between Stalin and Hitler. Yeah, and then they have to change. And like I read this book about Goebbels and like how it was difficult for him to like smoothly make like a propagandistic like and like believable like position and like how to make this transition like palatable to the population. It's really fascinating, right?
Yeah. So
and it's like what you were saying about like one diplomat who can like carve out a like bite-sized interpretation of like world events.
I think that's what's so awesome about the guy that will eventually succeed Mao, Deng Xiaoping, or Zheng Xiaoping. How do you say his name?
I always think of it so like this thing where Chinese words are like the same as other words, and it's like I always map it to that. So like I read about this protest that people did. It's really interesting. Like in the United States, we have all this like political like protest and like political art and stuff, which is just really blatant. It's like Donald Trump is bad, and you make like a image of Donald Trump like with a like chicken body or like getting like run over by a boat or something. And so like, but in China, it's really like fascinating because it's like more subtle. So I read about this protest, like Xiaoping means like small bottle. And so like they had some protests where they just like crushed a bunch of small bottles or something like that. And then it's like, oh, so obviously you're talking about Deng Xiaoping. Yeah. And so like for me, I always like make this mapping. And so yeah, like Xiaoping is like...
Xiaoping. All right, cool. But anyway, he reminds me of like... So he basically... So he was... Okay, so I guess let me just do the real quick smoothing what happened. So Mao and Zhou Enlai both die in the same year, which is 1976. Right as...
Oh, Zhou had cancer also. And like Mao let his cancer like progress or something like this and controlled access to doctors. This is really fascinating. And he was like only like letting the doctors like see him periodically and blah, 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 blah. Oh, it was so fascinating. Yeah. I forget where I read this.
It is. So like it's very obvious like Mao and Zhou Enlai are going to like die, or they're getting really old and isolated from the power structures right as the American alliance and Chinese relations are starting. And the idea of like who will become Mao's successor becomes like a really interesting Game of Thrones drama. There's this thing called the Gang of Four, which are like these four social political figures in China that...
Plus Mao's crazy wife.
Yeah, Mao's crazy wife was one of I mean, he was like a womanizer, right? Like he just had like a bazillion women and shit. But they're like a political entity that gains a lot of power and is potentially going to control a secession. Mao has his own named successor, this guy named
Hua
Guofeng. And there's another guy like named Lin Biao, who's a military general that is involved like providing military support to the Gang of Four. And like just what happens like over the course of a couple years is just crazy drama of like swings back and forth. Deng Xiaoping is in exile but has like a massive following because he's just like a great orator and like a super reasonable guy. But anyway, what ends up happening is Lin Biao is eventually killed, and this is a great story of he's in a plane out of China towards Russia, and it just crashes in Mongolia. And no one knows exactly what happened to it. It's like no one knows if he was trying to lead a coup against Mao, or if like he was just fleeing the country. Like no one understands this story at all. They just know that Lin Biao dies in a plane crash in Mongolia, and like some real shady stuff went down.
Yeah, it reminds me of this thing that happened like 7 years ago or something like that, when this Polish government was flying to Russia and their plane crashed with like everyone important from their government on it.
What it would be like if like Robert Mueller or something like just like dies in a plane crash and like no one knows what happened or something. But anyway, so the Gang of Four is eventually all arrested. There's like some crazy political drama with this, and Deng Xiaoping eventually becomes the he's not like the chairman of the Communist Party, but like for all intents and purposes, he like becomes the Chinese ruler. And what I was saying is like he has this he has a really hard job, right, of bridging the gap between these competing factions that are all trying to have control over China now, because this is the problem with like dictatorships in general. When you have like one person in power, is like you can be super cohesive and focused and move fast the way like Dubai, for example, does now. Like when you have a competent ruler with absolute power, they can, get shit done. But when that person dies, then what, right? It's always the issue of now what, because you don't have any formalized structure that's like any consensus agreed upon. It's just who becomes the next leader, and what if you don't agree with that, and then what happens. So there's kind of this issue. And,
like Nicolas Maduro getting...
getting droned today. Yeah. But anyway, so he reminds me, like the thing that he seems to do really well is bridge the gap of reversing every policy that Mao ever put into place while retaining the cultural integrity that Mao stood for as to like appease his following.
Yeah, and then also I think it's fascinating that every single bill in China, like of currency, has Mao's picture on it. Mao is like all over the place in statues and stuff like this, which I think is fascinating because in Russia they did the opposite thing. So like as soon as Khrushchev came to power, he did this de-Stalinization campaign where they like totally disgraced the memory of Stalin and whatever. Like in Prague, there was like, they just finished this giant statue of Stalin. And then like right after this de-Stalinization, they just bombed it. And now they have this like modern art, like weird ticking clock thing there. So it's like fascinating because I think it like destroys the continuity of like the Soviet system or whatever. And so like people like love Lenin, like even today.
Right.
But like Stalin is like anathema, no one can talk about him. But like in China, they had this really like, it's fascinating. It seems like Mao is like this proxy for like the old Chinese emperors of the past or whatever, and that like the new Chinese leaders just like put on this mantle of like, okay, like now I'm doing the job that Mao was doing, and like Mao was doing the job that like emperors were doing, and so on, and like we just like continue this progression forward. So it's fascinating as well to me that like, and this was like what Arthur Kroeber was talking about in that Chinese economy book, that like it's fascinating, like all these pundits in America think that like American democracy is so great and so on. And that like people in China like want this, but like I don't get that impression at all when I'm there. And then another fascinating thing too is like I was in Hong Kong in 2013 when this protest was going on against the like government of Beijing, and they were all saying that they wanted democracy. It was called like this democracy movement, but it was so weird to me because like what do you actually want? Like you want democracy? Like why? Will that make your life better? But like what they actually want is like lower apartment rents or like more stability of blah blah blah. Yeah, so and just it's fascinating how this word like democracy like stands in for like all this other just generally desirable stuff.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you want representation, I guess, in the political system. That's there's a really funny point that he made in that China's economy book, just to diverge for a second, that I thought was really interesting, which is there was this meme in every like revolution, like every democratic revolution, of like no taxation without representation.
Oh yeah,
that's like a powerful meme. It's like and most governments were like, all right, this meme is really powerful, so we want to collect tax revenue, so we need to provide representation in the government to have, you know, authority over how your money is spent. But the Chinese approach to it is, all right, fine, we just won't tax you then.
Yeah, so good.
Shit, no taxation without representation. All right, I guess we have to figure out a tax system that makes sense here.
Yeah, that's so funny,
it's
right?
Like you're not getting representation. But it's like the most brilliant fucking strategy, which is like, all right, we don't want people like getting rowdy about like democratic revolutions, so let's just like not tax them so that they don't like get giddy. It's like a hedge, you know?
Yeah. It's really interesting. I didn't know before I read that book that there's no capital gains tax in China, for instance.
No capital gains tax, and 5% of the Chinese government revenue is from personal income tax, where it's 50% in the US, which is also like, it's so interesting, right? Because we have this like LARP about libertarian like ism in the US, where you think the US is the most libertarian society like in the world. But then it's like your government is 50% personal income tax. China's government, right, that's communist and authoritarian, is 5% personal income tax. Yeah. So it's like, I think like we were thinking about it completely backwards in regards to that, right?
And also it just undermines how these words are just meaningless. Like, okay, Chinese government is communist. What does that actually mean?
Right.
Like,
right. And that's and I guess that's why like it's kind of interesting to read books like this in tandem, where you're reading about their modern economy and the history of China, because they all kind of play together. Where China is, and one of the memes of the China's economy book is that China is centralized in theory but decentralized in practice, and you come to like realize that it's the reality of governing China leads to naturally decentralizing forces, where it's like, well, it's too hard to tax, you know, 1 billion people, like, and keep track of it. So let's just have really small personal taxes and just collect taxes from like these really centralized massive businesses, get all our revenue from business taxes, and like that's practically easier to, you know, to implement.
It reminds me of this story actually. Like, so another part of that book was talking about how people get up in arms that Chinese companies copy the technology of the West and so on.
Right.
And then he was talking about how this phenomenon is actually like really integral to like startup countries a lot, and so like this U.S. textile manufacturing plant in Lowell, Massachusetts, was built on like 100% espionage from like some textile manufacturers in England or whatever. And then also like this guy, I forget his name exactly, but he was, so tea used to be like this thing in China that like the government didn't want to export to, like they didn't want to export the plants to the West because they considered it like trade secret or whatever, like their IP. And like when the British Empire tried to like get tea to India, they had to steal it. So like this guy who was like a botanist, he figured out like a way to transport plants on ships, because like before that, if you try to bring a plant on a ship, like it'll get salt water in it, it'll die. So he did that thing where maybe you did it as a kid where you just take seeds and water and then put them in like a plastic bag and then they'll still grow, like because they get sunlight. So then you can use this mechanism to bring plants on ships. So then he like went around China, he like dressed up like some important government official and then like fake spoke like Chinese, and when he would visit some places he would collect all the tea leaves from there and tell people that he was also Chinese but from some other distant part of the empire that you've never even heard of before.
Yeah.
And people would just be like, oh okay, cool, like I guess so, that makes sense.
And this is how the British East India
stole
Empire
tea,
got all the tea.
And then brought it to India.
Right. That is really interesting. So I was going back to the Deng Xiaoping. So he does a really good job. Like he reminds me kind of like one of these dudes that's, you know, trying to be like a progressive imam in like the Middle East right now, where it's like, okay, we have this like text that's considered sacred and like you cannot question it, whether it's like Mao's Little Red Book or the Quran or whatever. But like we need to like be able to pick and choose shit from this and just like say that that's the stuff that we're going to follow and ignore the rest of it. So you have to like figure out the balancing act where he's like, okay, let me like take some weird things that are considered Mao canon and like weave them together as like the only things that we value that are important, but that can give me the leeway to still respect Mao while also creating room for like progressive ideals. Mm-mm. So this dude is just such a beast in this book, and you realize like how great of a leader he was. So I didn't even realize this. He was like named Times Person of the Year twice. He's like considered one of the best political leaders of our generation, probably. So he rules for like 12 years and modernizes the Chinese economy in the sense that he allows for kind of a market economy to survive or like to emerge in like this socialist government structure. So yeah, it's kind of cool. So like
he has this nice quote, which is I think about the difference between capitalism and communism, which is like, who cares if a cat is black or white as long as it can catch mice?
Right. Yeah.
I think it's about that. But then it also like reminds me of this idea that like when you talk to people in China who are like Chinese Communist Party members about like, okay, so is China like really a communist country or like what's going on? They'll say that, I think this is like the official idea, is that communism is not a particular kind of economic policy that you have at any one time as conceived of by Karl Marx. It's like a idea of history and how history progresses. So like you start out with like feudalism and serfdom and so on, and then you move through to industrialization, and then you can move through to socialism and then to communism. And so it also touches back to like how they were trying to wed these ideas of Marxism and then like also the situation in China on the ground, which was like not industrialized, like kind of agrarian, whatever. And so they'll say like, yeah, so Chinese like civilization is like now moving through this phase of like bourgeois capitalism, and then later we'll progress into socialism, and then later we'll progress into communism, like that.
Gotcha. So it just gives them leeway to have policies that work now, but while still maintaining, yeah, we are socialists because that's our vision for the future. Yeah, it is cool. It's cool how they do that. I agree. It's it makes like America, where we're all like yelling at each other all the time, seem like kind of silly. But anyway, so yeah, so he modernized the economy, and I think like something that I realized reading this book is you can like almost make the argument that Deng Xiaoping like is like a top 5 like good figure for the world of all time, because China has so many people that if you're just like counting numbers, whoever like did a good thing for China is like, gonna win in the head count of like people whose lives he made better.
Yeah, but he also crushed the Tiananmen Square revolution, so people don't like him for that.
Right, so that's right at the end. It's like that either you die a hero or live long enough to see yourself. I don't really know what the deal with that is, so I guess that's in 1989. There's some protest that he just like squashes.
Yeah, which I think is fascinating too. Like, because I always tend to think that Russia went the opposite way of that, where like they had these protests and then they kind of like caved and then just let the Soviet Union just break apart. But like instead the Chinese government like cracked down on it and like kept it all together. So, and then I think that it worked out finally much better for China. Like, and just the lives of people in China. Like, I guess the lives of people in Russia, like at the time that the Soviet Union was collapsing, were like really chaotic and like destabilized everything and was just generally bad for like most people. But like in China, I think that like the lives of people have been getting progressively better,
right?
Like over the same time period, and that like you can backdate it to like 1989 and like the different paths that they took,
that is really
and the different way that they confronted this challenge.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Wow. Yeah, so it's like a fork in history for two ways that governments can handle their protests. And then you look at the evidence of what happened, and like the Chinese approach is actually superior.
Yeah, could
kind
be
of interesting, but yeah. So anyway, so China evolves, like, and then once you get past 1989, it kind of like the Kissinger book starts getting really fast, and he's just like wrapping things up. The crux of it is the 70s and the 80s, and that kind of brings you to the modern times. So China right now, and that's kind of where the train, like the China's economy book, really picks up in like the 90s. I think is where it kind of like gets to of how China's economy looks right now, and then how it's going to evolve. And there's a lot of interesting. Yeah, that book I thought was really insightful about just if you're trying to think of China from like, how do I do business in China? Where are the trends going? How can I like capture value from a startup perspective or something like this? That book was really, it was really well done. It was a really good overview of the different trends in China right now. So one of them is that China, right, is a one-party state. And this is something I actually want to ask you about, which I think is really interesting. So China is a one-party state, meaning there's a communist party and they have massive control over the political system and business and policy decisions. But there seems to not be that much social unrest over it. And that is the big question is, as China's economy evolves and becomes more modern and the middle class evolves and more people, they have to become more open to just the rest of the world, is political instability is it going to manifest itself and cave the entire country? So
there was this idea also from that book where he was talking about like autocratic regimes or whatever, and how like they're faced with this challenge between like economic dynamism, which like has tended to lead towards people wanting more like representation or whatever, or like some kind of different political structure, and then like versus like control of the state and like clamping down or whatever.
Right, so every authoritarian leader has to choose between consolidating power versus economic freedom that diminishes their power. And normally,
and that like it will be, so he was saying that like it'll be interesting to see how like the Chinese government is like dealing with this and so on. But yeah, I don't know.
It seems like the decision that's being made is consolidating power more so, like putting clamps down.
It's also interesting, I guess this book was written before Xi Jinping like became the emperor for life or whatever.
Yeah.
Wasn't that like more recent?
Yeah, that was this year, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's like an interesting development. But yeah, like who knows?
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things I think. So like economically wise, he's saying this is something that I've tangentially noticed too. So really starting in the last 10 years is China has evolved a middle class. And the middle class, right, is, he says, like, what you'd consider middle class in China is someone whose, like, average income is, like, $20K a year. Whereas in the U.S., it would probably be, like, $60K a year.
But that makes no difference, like, if you're actually living there because of the purchasing power and so on, like...
Well, yeah. But what's interesting, so the middle class of China also, like, the kinds of people that are making $20K a year they're only 25% of the country. Whereas the U.S. middle class is, like, more than half the country. So the middle class of China is actually more of an elite in terms of China, the way that they think of a middle class. And it's an elite that like is considered not even an elite by global standards. It's just like an interesting dynamic that's emerging. But because the numbers are so big, right, the denominator is so big, that middle class is still the largest demographic of international tourism. So there's more international tourists from China right now than any other country or any other place. And I've noticed that just being around different places over the last year. Like if you go to like the Louvre, the signs are in French, English, and Chinese. And I guarantee you that's like recent, like in the last couple of years. And like if you go to Harrods in London, like all the, you know, designer stores have Chinese translations. And like in New York City, obviously, I mean, the subways have like signs in Chinese and stuff like this. So that's a really interesting dynamic, just seeing the memeing of Chinese language and culture like spread internationally. It's also interesting because they're probably the biggest spenders of money also. So now everyone has like economic incentive to cater to Chinese culture where that might not have existed before.
Yeah, I think another interesting thing is like the inverse of this too, like the influx of foreigners into China. Because I feel like for the time of Mao, when China was like closed off, there was not really a lot of foreigners moving there. Or like, it's interesting because in the US we have like always so many immigrants and so on. Like one example of this is like people speaking English. Like I can understand really heavily accented English, you know?
Right, yeah.
But it's very fascinating that I would say a lot of people in China that I spoke to like had difficulty understanding my heavily accented Chinese.
Because it's just not a thing that they encounter.
Yeah. People speaking like really crappy Chinese. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I was going to say, so what do you think of this? So like, that was my question, is like, is China actually open, right, for investors? Like, what do you think of this like Peter Thiel thing that he always says is, so you'd expect, right? So China's GDP was growing like 10% a year. Now it's down to like 6% a year or something like this. And the US GDP grows at 3% a year. So like China's higher growth. And US is much more wealthy than China. Like the total GDP of the US is higher than China. Like it's almost double. And there's a quarter of the population of China or something like this. So like the US is doing much better economically. But we have a trade deficit with China. And it's the inverse of what you'd expect. You'd expect that the country that has a lot of money would invest in the high growth area because there's higher returns on their investment. But what you actually see is the country with less money investing in the lower growth area, like which is Chinese people investing in the US. And that's like the inverse of what would naturally happen. And the reason that happens is because the Chinese economy is so closed off. And it's because it's like, okay, if you want to invest in Chinese stocks, it's like non-obvious. Like you can't just like go open an E-Trade account, I think, and invest in like buy equity in Chinese companies. You can't just buy real estate in China the way that if you're Chinese, you can buy real estate in the US, which I think is really interesting, of just like a point that there's like an inversion of the natural thing because of the way that China's closed off their economy to like foreign investment. And I'm curious, I don't know, like I guess it's a trend for the future of whether or not it's actually going to open up and invert, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's interesting. So we were saying that there's the Chinese middle class was emerging. I also think, so tying into this, right, is the demographics of China too. So because they, you know, communism killed everyone in the 50s, they basically had their baby boom after that in like the 60s. And because of that, the demographics right now has like 5x the participation in the labor force that is of retirement age. So it's really easy to do these like Ponzi scheme welfare programs because it's like, all right, this is really easy. 1/6 of our population is retirement age. We have a massive workforce right now, but in like 20 years, it's going to like be completely different. You're gonna have like 1/3 of your population of retirement age and like 1/5 of the like labor force that you have now. And I guess this happened to Japan, right? This is so like, I was reading about this recently. After Hiroshima and like Nagasaki and like World War II and whatever, Japan had like a baby boom and they, you know, had this massive high growth economy that people are comparing China to. Like I didn't realize how beastly Japan was post World War II.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like I was watching this Larry King interview with Donald Trump, and he was talking about how like in the 80s, people from Japan were coming and buying up all the real estate in New York and blah, 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 blah.
And now it's like people from China.
And now he says the same things about China. So it's
You like... super one, but Japan now is like super conservative because everyone's old in Japan. And what happened to Japan, they call this like the lost decade, which I think is like a really fascinating concept, which is in the 1990s. So Japan was basically dominating. People thought like, you know, the yen would, you know, reach parity with the dollar as like an international reserve currency and things like this. The GDP growth actually reverted, and in the entire 1990s, the entire GDP of Japan went backwards because I guess they had financial crises, and this is the kind of stuff that happens to all these high growth countries. Like it happened to Brazil and Mexico and Argentina and South Korea. It's like when you just like go on a tear, like eventually you get like loaded up with foreign debt and when you can't repay it, it like devalues your currency, and then all the assets that are held in that currency like aren't worth as much as people thought they would, and it like collapses on itself. I don't really understand like economic, like I'm very new to economics, but this is just the way I think that these things happen. But
yeah, it was fascinating as well to me about this book by this guy from the Brookings Institute, because he like has to pretend that he understands like some or sees some causal relationship between things that are happening in these like giant macro trends, but it's like nobody really understands how all that stuff works, and it's like impossible because it's like a function with just like a million parameters, and it's just like
it's really easy to compare it to the closest thing, regardless of whether or not it's a good predictor. It's just like how you actually compare it. But I was saying like the thing that there's a meme that there was a line in the book that I really liked, which was China has the risk of Japan of that you get old before you get rich. And that's like such a cool idea that like you have this boom and like massive economic growth, and then you get too old and conservative, and like the welfare Ponzi schemes like invert themselves when you have a small labor force supporting a large retirement age population, that you just it stalls, you know.
Yeah, but it also reminds me of this idea from Paul Graham, which is like that, for instance, like there's the idea that like capitalism is always expanding and like getting bigger, but like, and like if you think about it in nature, like nothing grows like that, just like always getting bigger or whatever. But like it sort of can make sense in the idea that he was saying that, for instance, like if there's like an old crappy Mustang from like the 60s, and then you like spend one summer just like fixing it up and making it like a badass car, then like you just created value in the world where before there was none.
Right, exactly. It's not a fixed amount of wealth in the world.
Yeah,
you can create wealth with your hands and no money.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's fascinating that like, I don't know, I personally see like a lot of interesting and cool stuff like that's gestating in China, and like for instance, I like everyone in the US I see uses an iPhone, but I have been using this OnePlus phone, which I think was created by a bunch of engineers from this company Oppo, who were like based in Shenzhen and like have all of the manufacturing capacity like at their fingertips, like can just so easily get components to like build smartphones. And it's fascinating because I think that in the US we don't have this ability to like just engage in hardware hacking like this that you can do in China.
It's kind of interesting. So let me think about this. So in 2000, 5% of all electronics manufacturing exporting was done from China. Now it's something like 40% or like upwards of that. So there's just been like a massive growth. But the value capture of the Chinese electronics industry has been at like the lowest end of the spectrum, or like the least value generating. So like you have companies like Apple and Samsung are the two biggest designers of chips, and they design all the integrated circuits. They make the integrated circuits, and then they send them to China to be assembled into the iPhone. So they're doing all the design, the branding, the actual like chip engineering, and that's the highest ROI part. And then
the smile.
Yeah, exactly. The like labor of just assembling the phones together is the lowest value capture, but that's what that's the most of what they've been doing in China. So like, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like Foxconn, right, is like a massive company. It's the fourth largest by revenue like IT company in the world.
Yeah, that Taiwanese guy said that this could be described as a smile. So like in the bottom you have like high ROI for like just manufacturing like the silicon and so on.
Yeah.
And you have like high ROI for like selling the finished product, but it's like the lowest for actually like assembling the stuff, and that's where like a lot of those companies are specializing right now.
Right, yeah. But what I was going to say that I think is interesting is it seems like it's easy to invert that like from China's perspective, but not from our perspective. Like it's not easy for America to say we're going to capture the value of assembling and exporting the phones from the US, but it's easy for China to be like, we're going to design our own chips and make our own phones because we already have this infrastructure here. So like they're going to go up the food chain, but it's harder to like just capture the bottom of the food chain.
Interesting.
Which I think is going to be really interesting. And there's a couple companies, right? So this is like a meme that he talks about in the book that I think is interesting, is that for the most part, like Chinese companies have been really bad at doing the value capturing part of electronics manufacturing. And for the most part, there haven't been successful companies except like maybe like Lenovo, which so like there's another meme with like Chinese products that he says is Chinese electronics are 80% of the quality for 60% of the price. And there's a lot of value in that, right? Like Lenovo computers are just, you know, generic computers that are sold really cheaply, and it's the largest computer brand in the world because of the Chinese market where they manufacture, and like they've done a good job of like owning the entire system. And then Huawei, which it makes cell phones, I guess. I
think they're also like Cisco. They make all this like router stuff.
Okay,
too.
cool, yeah. Or they've done a good job of that. And then I guess now you have like DJI also, which is just crushing the drone game, like building the entire supply chain. But outside of that, they haven't had like the successes in doing that. But it seems like that's where things are going to go, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's also another thing that he was talking a lot about, which I thought was interesting, was that China has first world infrastructure and third world labor costs or whatever.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And then I think also, like, just harkening back to that discussion about Henry Kissinger, this idea of like first world and third world is interesting because I think that this term originated with the idea that America is first world, and then the Soviet Union is like the other, like second world or whatever, and the third world is like this unallocated places, like countries in Africa or South America that are like up for grabs or whatever. And like also into the thing that like that guy Nehru in India was trying to like be the leader of this third world, like third way, not with like the Soviet Union or with America, but like their own thing. But now we just use the word third world to mean like bad economy or blah blah blah.
Right. Oh, gotcha. So it wasn't it wasn't a derogatory term at first.
Yeah.
It was just kind of, yeah.
Like describing.
It was like a label. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind of interesting. Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch the electronics war over the next whatever. So like another thing that's like, okay, so like with this emerging Chinese middle class, there's going to be like such interesting business opportunities. That's like one of the things I was trying to think about while I was reading this. So he was talking about like e-commerce, like the obvious one is e-commerce, where like 5% of all Chinese retail is done over e-commerce. So like it's just a, you know, barbarically gargantuan market opportunity. And obviously that's why these companies like Alibaba and JD have just, you know, are valued at like whatever, like hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah, but I can say like from my own experience, like the online shopping experience in China is way better than in America.
Oh, how
like,
so?
Because there's this thing like 360buy.com. It's kind of like Amazon. You can go on in the morning and order something, and then some dude will deliver it to you on a bicycle later that day.
You're saying they have like a standing army of bicycle delivery men in China.
Kind of like hero protagonist in that Neil
Snow
Stevenson
Crash?
book. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. He's kind of like the legendary bike delivering pizzas in 20 minutes or less.
Yeah.
Yo, I was thinking, yeah, that's kind of interesting. What was it? You know what? I lost my train because I was thinking about Snow Crash. You got me into that. But oh yeah, the delivery on bikes, e-commerce, yeah, whatever. But anyway, yeah, the e-commerce stuff is interesting. But I think what's going to be interesting is I wonder like just how big the market opportunities are going to be for just things that already exist in the U.S. that have worked on middle class that you could just like port to China. So like the obvious market opportunities are going to be things,
yoga, huh?
Oh yeah, like that's what I'm thinking about. Like fucking organic juices, yoga, Peloton bikes, just memeing that stuff into China, and just it would be really funny. But no, but things like financial services, where like okay, now you have money to invest.
Oh, you know what's also an interesting thing?
That's going to be big. And
okay, dig this. Google is like banned in China. So like think about this. Like basically the biggest market share of phones in China is Android, because it's like all the Chinese phones use Android, right?
Right.
But like since there's no Google Play Store, so like all the apps that we use for Android phones don't exist in China. So like you could just easily take an app that exists in the Google Play Store,
and just
put it in Chinese, and then sell it in the Huawei Play Store.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Is that what people do?
I was doing that for a while.
Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah. That's the. I wanted to ask. Yeah. Like, do you think that that's going to continue? That they're going to just have all these American software products completely banned in China, and continue doing
Yeah,
that
probably. I mean, it's so fascinating to me. Like, one of the ways that I think... So, I'm usually, like, a kind of fanboy of the Chinese government. I think they do things in a good way. But one of the ways that I'm not is how they ban books there. I think it's so ridiculous. Because, like, if you're a smart person and you, like, study in Tsinghua or anything like that, and just, like, have an idea of, like, what goes on in the world, you, like, read English media and stuff like this, then, like, when you hear that a book is banned by the Chinese Communist Party, then you'll go and read it.
Right,
It's
yeah,
like
obviously.
a curated reading list of like what shit is interesting. Like, honestly, I wish that the US government would ban books, and then I would know what's next for me to download from Audible, you know what I mean? Or like whatever. Because it's like, okay, there's something in this book which is interesting enough for them to say don't read it, so it makes me want to read it.
Yeah. I mean, I've had that experience because I have books that like people get mad at me for reading. Or like say like don't read that, like Pickle, right, which is Sasha Shulgin. So that's Sasha. I gave it to you.
Oh yeah.
So it's like Sasha Shulgin is the guy that invented or I guess you don't invent drugs, but he discovered synthesis methods for hundreds of psychedelic drugs that are basically every psychedelic drug you've heard of that's in mainstream was invented by this guy. And he wrote like journals about his distillation processes and how he discovered these drugs and him testing them out and what he thought the effects were and why he thought they were interesting. And like I've had people like mad at me for reading this book, like just for being like, hey, this is an interesting book, and they'll be like, how can you say that? It's like crazy. But yeah, I think that like in the US it's probably like opposite, right? It's like, so there's this idea of like in China and Russia and authoritarian governments where you have really vertical censorship, where you have one state party or one entity being like, you can't read this content, or hey, you ban this dude from talking. But in the US, it's way more like distributed and horizontal, where you have like social pressure not to read things or not to do things. And yeah, it's kind of like no government will ever ban a book, but like people will tell you not to read books or things, whereas like in Russia no one would do that, but the government would tell you not to do it.
Yeah.
But like there would be no guy like, hey, you shouldn't read this book, it's too dangerous, like,
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting how that actually plays out. But it's also interesting, like books like Pickle, like you can't buy them on Amazon, you have to like buy them from like third-party distributors, so there is kind of like a censorship mechanism, but it's just done through like corporations.
Yeah, I often think about this, that like, so one of the things that people frequently mention when they're talking about why the Chinese government is so bad is that, oh, there's internet censorship in China. But one of the things that I noticed, which I thought was interesting, is that, so you can get any movie or any book or any song just on the Chinese internet, like, so easily. And so this is exactly the content that you can't get in America. You can't download movies, and you can't download books, and you can't download songs because they're blocked. So this is a kind of censorship, right? And so like the Chinese government has like censorship of some news sources and blah blah blah. But like you know what I mean? It's like we have our internet censored in one way.
We totally do. I mean, like
they have their internet censored in another way. But both of our internets finally are censored.
Right.
But like they're just different.
But even like, okay, so like news, like Breitbart, for example, there's like protest, like there's legitimate pressure to remove advertisers from Breitbart to like choke their business model, right? So, and like the argument I guess that people would make is, well, that's not censorship if we just economically attack a business for publishing news we don't like. Whereas, but like in theory, in practice, right, it's the same thing. Or like Twitter is a company that can censor your speech and just like ban your account without recourse. So yeah, I don't know, like I think that's probably an accurate summation that like internet is censored in the US the same way it is in China. It's just different end goals and like end means. I wanted to ask you, what do you think of WeChat, by the way?
I don't know. I've never used it. It became more popular like right around the time I was leaving. So
because I know it's so interesting. So I've only been to China twice and for a week each. So I've only spent like 2 weeks there. But I know like in cryptocurrency community and like the entire like Web3 movement, people like are really into WeChat. So I guess like the idea of it is kind of interesting. So the government, the Chinese government likes having your identity censored or like centralized in one place because it makes it really easy to spy on you. So it's really great if you just have one identity, the government hooks and like can spy on it, but then an application developer or a retail outlet can just integrate into the universal identity standard that the government has like created. And like they did this to be like authoritarian, but it actually like creates an interesting dynamic of okay, well, you have your WeChat identity, and you're basically forced to use it. And then as an application developer, I can just integrate with that. So like I'm a restaurant and I want to just, like add you to some subscription list. Like I just use your WeChat thing that you use to pay for this, and like, hey, do you want to be added to my subscription list? Yes, for example. Mm-hmm. So it's actually like this really interesting like use case of having a universal identity system that, and then like all applications exist as like these small add-ons to like your global identity. Whereas like people that want like your Bitcoin or Ethereum address to be your universal identity, like there's like it's kind of just interesting, that approach versus like, it's like Facebook tried to be your universal identity. That was like the thing that they set out to do, and they were the best thing for a really long time. But like, I don't know, it's pretty obvious to me at least that like Facebook's not going to be your universal identity. Like there's no way it's going to succeed in that mission. So it's interesting, to just see like what is going to, actually be able to do something like that.
Yeah, one of the points about Facebook that I thought was interesting was that I deleted my Facebook account. Like, so when I was living in Beijing, I would never check it because it was blocked by the internet censor or whatever. So like I only checked it like once every 6 months, and then I would just like see and like be able to reflect on how stupid it was. So then finally I just deleted it. And then, like, this was kind of annoying because it shut me out from using some services that required you to have a Facebook account, such as Venmo. But I just recently created a Venmo account, and I didn't need a Facebook account to do it. So they're, like, disassociating themselves from Facebook, whereas, like, they started out...
Right. Well, because it was the best thing. It was like 2004. There was nothing like that to serve as like a digital identity. The entire idea of digital identity is probably like really weird back then.
Yeah, but it's like, fascinating that like
Freenode and IRC usernames and AOL Instant Messenger like that was the only concept of digital identity. We didn't have this concept of like your persona online.
Yeah, true.
Facebook like started that, I think. But yeah, it's interesting. Like because to me like that's one of the big battles of the next 5 years of like whoever's going to create that is going to create something like massively important. And it's just interesting to like how China has like an approach to it that kind of works. Something else I wanted to talk about. So another thing this book talks about that I think is really interesting, just from the stuff that I'm interested in, like Bitcoin in particular, is the energy usage in China. So China is 75% funded by coal, or like powered by coal, and the US is something like 40%. And like Europe is like 25% powered by coal. So like China, and like one of the reasons for that is they just have coal reserves, right? Like it's there. Like natural gas is better for the environment, but they have to import it. They only have like 1% of the world's natural gas reserves versus like 13% of the world's coal reserves or something like this. But it's like so interesting that like China just burns a shit ton of coal and doesn't give a fuck about like polluting the environment. And that gives them like a competitive advantage in things like Bitcoin mining because they can make energy cheaper. And yeah, it's like a tragedy of the commons thing where like the only thing you can do is like compete against them by like also making energy cheaper by polluting the environment. It's like one of the big like I guess like people understand this is a problem with like climate change or whatever,
but isn't it also that I think it's something like I was talking with this guy who's a Bitcoin miner, and he was telling me that so his like mining operation is set up in the west of China, where they made some like one of these ghost cities where they just like on spec built like a huge like town that no one wanted to live in. So there's like a power plant that like is built to serve this city, but no one lives there. So like power is not the kind of thing that you can just store it. Once you like make it, you have to use it.
Yeah.
So he just went there and then just gets the electricity like on discount because like they need.
It's actually he's doing a service for the grid by like balancing the grid by using the electricity. Oh, that is so interesting. Yeah, I didn't put that together. So I know that this is a thing, right? Because like when I was in Shanghai, like you notice that there's fucking cities and massive complexes that just nobody lives in. Like it's very bizarre. And I guess they had like I don't know why they did this, where they built all this housing that no one lives in, but it like all happened in like one like 5-year period. Mm-hmm. He talks about it in this book. But because of that, what was it? Oh yeah, it's something like it's interesting. They build all this stuff really, really fast, but they built it like super energy inefficiently. Like they weren't caring about like the insulation factors and like heating costs of the building or anything like this. So it's like, yeah, China can they can like be doing good things energy wise because like they're trying to like make renewable power. Like they're building this, I forget what it's called, like the Ganshu wind farm. It's just like ridiculous, like the world's biggest wind farm. Like why not just like putting up like 35 windmills a day, you know, for like years. But like it just doesn't matter because, you know, like the way the rest of the country is like structured. It's interesting. But yeah, the Bitcoin thing is kind of interesting because they had built all these houses that are just empty. So they'd planned to power it. So they have all this excess power. Like, of course, you're going to mine Bitcoin. Like, that's the perfect thing to do with excess power, right?
Yeah.
That you have to use for some purpose. Yeah, that is really interesting.
Yeah, the guy who I was talking to specializes in Bitcoin mining and also cattle farming because there's just like so much open spaces there. And I was like, nice. That's a good hedge against proof of stake.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah, wow. What an interesting exercise. I don't know. I
like
feel
making steaks.
Yeah, I got the joke. I'm trying to think. I feel like there's. Oh, yo, this stuff's so interesting too. Okay, so like, going back on the demographics. Have you ever heard of this? Apparently, they had in China this thing called like the State Family Planning Commission, or is like.
Oh yeah, this was funny.
It's basically like a government agency that oversees like family planning, but it sounds like the DMV or some shit. Where if you want to like have a second child, you have to like go like petition to the DMV or something, and like they like interview you and see how you're raising your first kid and decide if they'll like grant you an exemption for like having a second child.
Yeah, this is interesting as well because it's like you can have a second kid if you're rich, like because the only thing is that you get free education and free healthcare and blah 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 for your kid, for your first kid. But then the way that they enforced this one child policy was that if you had another kid, you had to pay for all of that stuff. So then I have like some friends from China who have brothers and sisters, but they're always like really, really rich. And like their dad is like a general in the PLA or something like this.
It's so interesting to me. Like I was thinking about it. Like I feel like for the most part, like most of the Chinese people that I know, even though like the ones in the US, like don't have siblings. It's like, kind of interesting.
But one of the things I thought was interesting about this agency was that like the alignment of incentives and then the outcomes that you get. Like they were collecting a lot of money from like people violating this by like collecting
fining
fees.
Them for having unprotected sex or something with the kid like whatever the fuck they were doing.
So then they have like some just like impetus to like continue on in that way, and like even when the policy like satisfied like the intention, they like keep it going longer just because of the momentum that this organization had.
They're incentivized to keep themselves alive. So it's like if you're like overseeing people violating the family planning rules of China, and you have to fund yourself with your revenue you get from people, you know, committing fines, you're incentivized to like make it seem like it's a massive problem that everyone's violating this, so that you get more, you know, funding from the government. Which is, I mean, it's so interesting. But I was thinking about this, like, is this like, I was thinking when I was reading it that this seems like the most draconian, like, here's your socialist like hellhole kind of like agency where it's, if you want to have a kid, you have like a fucking government agency like right in your face like about it. But then I was like thinking, like, is that the worst idea? You know, like, is it terrible if you have to like justify like having a second kid? And like if someone's like, oh, your first kid, you're kind of like raising it like shit. We're just not gonna grant you a second kid till you step shit up. Like I feel like it's like not the worst, right?
Yeah, I mean, who knows how it will like eventually play out? Because I think that the like effects overall of this policy have like yet to be totally like determined.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's interesting. It's also fascinating to me that like the government wields so much influence over society there. Like I think that if the US government tried to institute some policy like that, people would go crazy.
I know, yeah. I mean, rightfully so in my opinion, because it's like it's straight up like interfering with your ability to, you know, experience your life to the fullest, right? If you want to have 3 kids, that's like a decision that you would make.
Yeah, I don't know though. It's fascinating. It's like part of this like social contract though, you know what I mean? Because like I just don't know.
I like the stat that he put in that the replacement like thing for, so if your population wants to sustain itself, you need to have each family have an average of 2.1 kids, which I guess kind of makes sense. Or like say like 50% of people get married and have kids, and then like 1 out of 10 like dies horrifically or something. So like 2.1 is like approximately right. But yeah, like they have like an entire generation like having 1 kid. So, or like the average rate was like 1.6 for a really long time. So it was like below population rate.
One of the effects of this that I thought was really fascinating was that, okay, so if you study computer science in like so I never studied computer science in the US, but like in Germany, like the room is basically full of dudes, and then there's like 2 or 3 girls in the class. But in China, I was studying computer science in Hong Kong, and it's basically like maybe 60-40 or something like this.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think the reason is because like if you have a guy who is like a great engineer at like some whatever Chinese company or whatever, then he has this, under this one child policy, he has a daughter. He like teaches his daughter all this dope engineering stuff that he learned. But like my friend from Brazil, he was telling me that like, so he's like a really awesome engineer. And he was saying that, like, yeah, his parents, like, taught him all this engineering stuff. But, like, his sister, they didn't teach her this at all.
Right. You're like, go play with dolls or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. So there's, like, a really lot of really good Chinese software engineers who are female that I met.
Interesting. I've noticed that with, like, Eastern Europe also.
Yeah.
I think it's just because it's just so commoditized there. Like, there's not this, like, glorification around, like, startups or whatever. It's just, like, a labor job. It's, like, the same thing in the U.S., like, in the 50s and 60s. Like, there were more women programmers than men because it was considered, like, a labor-intensive job. It was just, like, rote and mechanical. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Cool. All right. How long have we done? Like, I think that was, like, at least 90 minutes of stuff. Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts about the books before we wrap it up?
I don't know. One of the things that I think about also with Eastern Europe and like software engineers who are female from there is like, so one of my friends was telling me that like in the Soviet Union, it was illegal not to have a job. Everyone had to have a job. But like in the US in like the 50s and stuff, like Leave It to Beaver, like the Brady Bunch, women didn't have jobs then.
Right.
But in the Soviet Union, they had as like engineers and stuff like this.
That is kind of interesting. I was also thinking, it's so funny, like, going back to, like, Mao, just because he literally governed in memes, you know, like, he just had, like, aphorisms, and he'd, like, try to put them in policy, but one of his is just, if we have more people, we'll have a more powerful army, so, like, we should just have more people. That's, also, like, what encouraged this baby boom to begin with.
Yeah, but so, one thing that I think is interesting about Mao is that, like, being a leader in China, I think you also have to be, like, a poet. And, like, you have to... Like, Mao wrote poetry. And it's, like, kind of interesting just to read them. And, like, also he was, like, really into this, like, Chinese calligraphy. Like, writing Chinese characters in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
And, like, one of the... so Mao's handwriting is, like, one of the most popular, like...
Oh, styles.
Yeah, styles of writing Chinese calligraphy.
Oh, that's so interesting, yeah.
And then, like, another interesting thing I think about Chinese leaders is all the leaders of America recently, except for one, are lawyers. You know what I mean? They went to law school.
Huh.
But
so
like
Clinton, Obama,
yeah. But then all the leaders of China are engineers. They all studied engineering at like Tsinghua.
Wow, that is interesting.
Yeah.
I think it probably makes sense, right? Like all lawyers are like all commissioners of sports leagues also, because it's when you have to like bridge the gap between, like, lawyers teach you to like see both sides, law school teaches you to see like both sides of issues. And I feel like, yeah, so like if you're a commissioner of a sports league, it would be, okay, there's the players and the owners, and I have to bridge the gap between them. Who's going to be good at that? Lawyers. And like maybe politicians in the US is the same, because you're just taking both parties' interests and like giving them something palatable. And that's why you get these like milquetoast characters, you know, like those Republican freaking debates outside of Trump. They're just the most like generic suits that are just useless at, you know, doing anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, that makes sense that when you don't have to be palatable to like 51% of people, that you could just have someone that's like more technically inclined or things like that to be a leader. Yeah, that makes total sense. I was going to say, yeah, I think it's interesting just how Mao's like insanity during the Cold War, like I wanted to talk about that earlier, but just some of his sayings are just so funny. About literally he told the Russian, like, he were said to Nixon, or I forget, maybe this wasn't to Nixon, but he was like, it would actually solve a lot of problems if the Russians came and killed everyone over 30 in China. He's like, that would just be awesome. Like, we could fix this like dialect issue where like people speak different dialects of Chinese, and it would just like be great. Like, we have hundreds of millions of people under 30. It would, you know, just speed things up. It's like, who the fuck talks like that? You know, like,
where he like famously was saying that like a nuclear bomb wouldn't be like a disaster in China because of the population or stuff like that. Yeah,
exactly. He's like, we could kill 500 million and we'd still have 500 million left. It's not so bad.
Yeah, and that's like, crazy. Yeah. But I think a lot of this as well is like, so I think this idea of like political rhetoric and stuff like that too is interesting. because it's like Henry Kissinger in this recent interview that I was watching with him in Face the Nation was talking about how campaign rhetoric can't be the basis of like actually governing a country. And he was talking about this in relation to Donald Trump. And then I think that a lot of this like tough talk and so on is a lot of the times just like posturing. And I guess as well goes back to like the idea that at that time when Mao was like doing all these things and saying all these things, like he was operating under conditions of like super uncertainty from like the perspective of his like adversary in this way, like that they couldn't go to China and like see what is like the situation there, which is like a lot different than today when we can just travel there or whatever.
Yeah. All right. So if someone wants to go visit China, where do you recommend they go visit?
I think they should go to Beijing, because Beijing is like so like with Chinese culture. Like if you go to Shanghai has like the Bund, which is like this area where European like companies came and set up like banks and so on, and like the French concession and blah blah blah. But like in Beijing, it's like they have this area which is called the Hutongs, and it's like this old way that people used to live together in like ancient Beijing and stuff like this. And like also just like the culture there is so much like more like Chinese centric. So they have like this really dope punk rock scene, really cool art scene, whereas like Shanghai is more like cool international like I don't know, techno music airport lounge style, where you can go to a bar and like sit bougily with your cocktail and so on.
Gotcha.
But Beijing's more like you go to like some cool ass like punk rock nightclub where people are just like smoking these like Chinese style cigarettes. And
do they
like,
hand roll cigarettes in China?
Yeah, and also you can smoke inside.
Oh yeah. And
like yeah, it's just more realer, I think. Like my friends from Beijing often say that like Beijing is New B, and which is like this Chinese expression that means somehow awesome or cool, and Shanghai's Juanbi, just like faking this. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd also I did a week in Shanghai and a week in Shenzhen. Shenzhen's really cool also, because they have these this is like the electronics supply hub of the world. And they have these like Seg Electronics markets where they just have every electrical component like you could possibly imagine like for sale at malls dedicated to them, where they have, you know, entire floors of malls that sell LEDs and like different form factors of LED strips and LED matrices and LED like soldered on LED like surface mount LEDs. And it's really mind blowing just to see the scale at that electronics operation. And yeah, that's the thing that's probably driving my interest in China right now, is just how the electronic supply chain is going to evolve over the next, you know, N years or whatever.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. All right, so yeah, that's basically our first attempt to just talk about a topic at length and record it. And yeah, we'll see how it comes out and hopefully do more of these.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Anything else to say real quick?
Not particularly.
All right.
Looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah, cool. We'll get better at it.
Yeah.
For sure. All right, cool.